My topics: Japan's occupation of China, impact, memory, and geopolitics. From 1931 to 1945, Japan occupied much of North and East Central China through military conquest. The Japanese Imperial Army deployed more than 2 million troops within the occupied territories for 8 years. Tokyo also established a pro-Japanese government in Nanjing. Officially, the reorganized nationalist government of China, with a puppet Chinese army of 2 million to fight against China's war of resistance. From 1937 to 1945, Japan's occupation and the Chinese resistance had a strong impact and changed the country forever. During the War of Resistance against the Japanese occupation, the Chinese Communist forces enjoyed the tremendous development from 50,000 to over 1 million regular troops. After the Civil War resumed between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang KMT in 1946, Chiang Kai-shek lost mainland China and had to remove the seat of his government to Taiwan in 1949. The Taiwanese and the Chinese developed different memories about the Japanese occupation of China and the Pacific War. In China, between the 1950 and 1970, the collective memory focused on CCP's war efforts behind the enemy line and derived much of the identity and legitimacy from their roles in the Pacific War and portrayed their policy and action as patriotic and heroic to protect the Chinese people and save the country from Japanese occupation force. In 1980 to 2000, the Japanese occupation had been remembered by major atrocities that heavily affected civilians, coming from both the direct aggression of the Japanese Imperial Army and the local collaborated Chinese government. From the 2000 to 2020s, the Japanese occupation culminated what many Chinese elites considered a century of humiliation and led to the creation of a new China. Part 1, Japan's occupation of China. In September 1931, Japanese Imperial Army seized Manchuria, northeast China, and established state of Manchukuo, the state of Manchuria, in 1932. Chiang Kai-shek, President of the Republic of China and the chairman of the Kuomintang, was hesitant to confront the invaders, feeling that his KMT armies were not prepared to face the Japanese. The nationalist Chinese army's credibility was substantially damaged by the repeated defeat suffered by the KMT troops under Japanese attack. Defeated on the ground, the Chinese Air Force could not achieve air superiority. This inability to defend her territory is linked to her lack of national unity. This combined with Jiang's priority with fighting against Chinese Communist Party. On July 7, 1937, Japanese troops attacked Marco Polo Bridge and then occupied Beijing. So officially, the total war between China and Japan started on July 7, 1937. In September, Chiang Kai-shek and his government made public and declared for KMT, established a coalition with the CCP and recognized the legal status of the CCP. Before September, communists was bad guys, outlaws, anti-government insurgents. Jiang had been fighting against communists for now about 12 years, not anymore. So September, again, 1937, there is a coalition between CCP and KMT. Thereafter, anti-Japanese United Front formally came into existence. The Soviet Union formally supported CCP-KMT coalition through the war. Although the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin favored financial aid to the CCP, he began to support Jiang's KMT army. Mao Zedong, the CCP chairman, often complained about how little he received compared to Jiang's reception of hundreds of millions of dollars from Moscow. As part of the agreement, the main force of the CCP Red Army, located in the northwest and numbering about 50,000, a small force, became the 8th Root Army of the National Army in August 1937, moved behind enemy line and conducted guerrilla campaigns in the mountains behind the Japanese line. In the south, communist guerrilla troops reorganized into the 4th Army, totaling about 10,000 men. The Japanese occupation provided the Communist Party with a unique opportunity to organize its power. It successfully appropriated and manipulated local nationalistic sentiment to create a patriotic image that legitimized his action in eyes of residents to build a political base of support. In November, Japan concentrated 220,000 troops and began an offensive campaign against Nanjing and Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek and KMT High Command deployed nearly 700,000 troops to defend Nanjing-Shanghai region. On November 7, the Japanese 10th Army successfully landed at the Hangzhou Bay. In December, the Japanese seized Nanjing. Iris Zhang pointed out in her book, The Rape of Nanjing, the forgotten Holocaust of World War II. After the Japanese troops entered the capital city, Nanjing, they killed 90,000 POWs and 260,000 civilians. Jiang's army continued an ineffective defense throughout 1938 to 1941. Despite a few victories in the Battle of Taizhuang and Wanjialing, China suffered continued crushing and humiliating defeats at the hands of Japan and was subject to a devastating, brutal occupation of much of the nation. By March 1938, almost all of North China again and Eastern China fell into China's hand. Even though, look at the map, it's pretty much about 1/3 of the country, but that's about 3/4 of the population under the Japanese control. From July 1937 to November 1938, Jiang lost 1 million troops, while eliminating about 250,000 Japanese soldiers. The KMT army withdrew to China's southwest and northwest to conserve some of their troops. when Jiang removed the seat of his government from Nanjing to Chongqing, Sichuan. By the opening of Europe's Second World War in September 1939, the KMT had lost coastal and post cities that once had been their base of power. Meanwhile, Japanese forces slowed their southward advance, stopping short at China's southwestern region. The Chinese War of Resistance entered a protracted phase, lasting for 6 more years. American pilots and volunteers traveled to China during those years, provide air defense for Jiang's wartime capital and other cities well known as Flying Tigers. As Japan continued to pump troops and other implements of war into China, the Chinese government was divided. In March 1940, with assistance from Japanese advisors, Wang Jingwei, former KMT vice chairman, established a pro-Japanese government in Nanjing. The collaborative government had political and economic support from the Japanese occupation force. In Tokyo, the office of the Great East Asia Sphere sent Japanese advisors to Wang Jingwei and provided advisory assistance and military aid. Japanese Prime Minister Konoe called it the Chinese self-government or Chinese governing Chinese. Nevertheless, first of all, Japanese command wanted Wang Jingwei to mobilize pro-Japanese Chinese and established an effective puppet army against resistance within occupied territory. Since those Chinese, pro-Japanese Chinese, or local Chinese, knew the terrains, people, and work conditions better than the Japanese troops. From 1940 to 1945, the Wang Jingwei's government mobilized nearly 2 million Chinese into his army, including 560,000 defected KMT troops to fight against the Chinese. In January 1943, his government declared war against Allied powers. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong called Wang Jingwei traitors, but had to fight a large number of the puppet Wang's force. When Jiang lost his best troops in the war against Japanese occupation, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong conducted successful guerrilla warfare behind the enemy line in 1938 and 1941, and recruited a large number of peasants into his force. Their operations behind Japanese lines showed great potential. The units of the 8th Route Army marched to the enemy-occupied territories where they carried out the guerrilla operation and established military and political bases. The communist strategy and tactics were also more effective, taking advantage of the Japanese belief that they had successfully secured occupied region. The communists focused on the destruction of supply lines, demolitions, and dismantling of the transportation. The 8th Route Army increased from 50,000 in 1937 to 200,000 men in 1939, and again to 500,000 in 1940. In South China, the 4th Army moved north and south of Yangtze River, established bases in southern China. In each base, the CCP established government, reduced peasant rent and interest, returned land to the poor peasants, and armed the masses. One of the historians quote, "Communist guerrilla did create difficulties for the Imperial Army in some areas, but the CCP did not come close to challenging Japanese power in the key regions of China. Still, in part, because of the very visible failures of the KMT, communist propaganda was quite successful. Part 3, impact of the occupation. First, a new vigorous nationalism sprang from a common threat in the war. It was no longer a traditional Han-Chinese ethnic conflict or KMT partisan nationalism, but a modern Western-style state nationalism emphasizing China's independence, sovereignty, self-government, political self-determination, and nation-state building. Chiang Kai-shek finally became a national leader during the war after Japan's occupation and received the popular support through the war from all the social groups, such as peasants, urbanized intellectuals, and even the warlords. Secondly, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the struggle against colonialism in East Asia gained international support by resisting Japanese conquest and colonization. The Allied powers supported both KMT and CCP. The nationalist movement in China, Korea, and Vietnam, as Richard just mentioned, became internationalized through the war. It wasn't just their fight, local fight, Asians fight, but it's our fight. We saw it as an extension, as our war effort against Tokyo and Berlin. So during the war, the nationalist government received Allied recognition. Chiang Kai-shek joined FDR, Winston Churchill, and even Stalin as the Big Four in an unprecedented activist in international diplomacy and as the leader of a big nation. Chiang wasn't just became a national leader, part of the international players during the war because of the war efforts and also Washington's promotion. Efforts by the Chinese to resist Japanese occupation led to the Japanese resorting to more offensive campaign. In 1941-42, the Japanese command concentrated forces in China and launched a new campaign. They called it Mopping Up Operation, or 3-0 campaign, where Japanese forces made it a task to kill all, loot all, and burn all. Japanese wanted to stop the guerrillas in their rear areas. Japanese atrocities continued throughout the war, ranging from torture to indiscriminate bombing to the killing of prisoners and random massacres of civilians. In the wake of the Allied Forces campaign across the globe in 1944, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong also launched partial counteroffensive against Japanese occupation forces. When Chinese internationalized his status through World War II and formed an alliance with the United States in the Pacific War against Japan, the KMT might have been able to nationalize China by the end of the war. Finally, in August 1945, more than 1 million Soviet Red Army troops entered northeast China, or Manchuria, and took over the state of Manchuria. On August 15, Japan surrendered. The price in Chinese lives for resisting Japan's aggression was very high, just as our keynote speaker Rich mentioned here. The most straightforward summary of the effect of the Japanese occupation on Chinese society was death. Here is number, the total military death, about 3 million, including both Nationalist Army and the Communist Army. Nationalist Army totaled about 2.4 million deaths. My number here, Chinese civilian deaths, a little bit lower than Rich's total. According to Rich's statistics, total civilian death in China about 12 million. So here is about the 10 million. As the result of the wartime allies, the political parties in East Asia accepted international leadership of allied powers such as the United States and the Soviet Union after the war. However, the allied leaders considered post-war China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan as an international issue. They look bigger picture, much broader than Chiang Kai-shek and other Asian leaders who had much narrowed agenda for their own national survival and post-war order. Thus, at the conferences, Carroll, and Yalta, Chiang Kai-shek accepted outlined post-war settlement and arrangement, which actually had a negative impact on the post-war China. So the allied powers, including the United States, failed to forge an effective long-term partnership that may have prevented the Soviet Union and the communists from expanding to the Pacific region and avoided the Cold War in East Asia for several decades to come. The last part, part 4, memory of the occupation in China. The similar experience created the national mythology. Country like China is affected by their memory and the legacy of the Pacific War. To view the war as a tragedy is obvious. Both Taiwanese and the Chinese remembered the Japanese occupation of China by the major atrocities. Furthermore, it appears the Chinese populace to point out the dedication of Chinese partisan politics to resist the Japanese occupation, which contributed to the political makeup between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party after the war. So the memory of Pacific War takes two dominant forms among the Chinese. One, a nationalist view on Taiwan. When I talked to President Ma Ying-jeou, he shared the Taiwanese view, and another, a communist view, the Chinese view. So Japanese occupation is remembered differently in China. Depends on the current political situation, and also has become more confused by the international relations and the crisis. So for the Chinese view, I mean the view by the mainland Chinese, three different views evolved, changed from time to time. The first period from 19 1950 to 1970 during Mao's era. We know Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China in October 1949. After the founding of the PRC, Beijing claimed the leadership of the war of resistance against Japanese occupation. The war became a sense of pride for the CCP. The memory provided many national myths about the heroism of the generation which fought off the Japanese invaders. It raised the legitimacy of the Communist Party and allowed his leaders to claim the mantle of nationalism in addition to his class appeal. The CCP created a collective memory of their war efforts behind enemy line and built monuments and museums of their guerrilla heroes. During Mao's era of the 1950s and 1970s, the Chinese communists derived much of their identity and legitimacy from their role in the Pacific War and portrayed their policy and action as patriotic and heroic to protect people and save the country from the Japanese occupation. The remembrance of the war, however, caused some issues. The action that the Chinese took pride in, such as the victory, led to disagreement between China and Taiwan. With one nation starting that CCP fought more in the war will minimize the major role played by the KMT force on the front line. Taiwan says, according to President Ma Ying-jeou, the KMT did most of the fighting. Overall, the nationalist government contributed the majority of the forces to oppose Japanese in the war of resistance. After Mao died in 1976 and the new leader Deng Xiaobing took over the power during Deng's era from 1980 to 2000, Chinese began its reform movement and opened toward outside world, including Japan. The Chinese war memory shifted to a victim mentality of the Japan's atrocities. For example, the Deng Xiaoping government opened the National Museum of the Nanjing massacre to show the extreme scale with China's suffering when the Japanese killed men, women, and children. There were also as many as civilians and military deaths as we showed these numbers a little bit earlier. Now, in the 1980s and 2000s, the remembrance of the war caused some issues. For example, some historians in Japan refer to the rape of Nanjing as an incident and that the casualties estimated of 300,000 made by the Chinese is far too high. A sad fact remains to these days that the Japanese denial of their war atrocities, even when presented with the evidence by surviving witness and accompanying film and other physical evidence. The third period, the current memories of the war from 2000 to 2020s, the Japanese occupation culminated what many Chinese elites considered the last stage of the century of humiliation. During the century of humiliation, China lacked sufficient hard power to defend its interest and broad and territory integrity, and as a result, suffered from frequent military invasion and losses. This concept drive Chinese grand strategy and desire to create a rich country and strong military and Chinese-led East Asian order. The war memories revived the Chinese nationalism and created a highly politicalized population that would support Beijing's aggressive foreign policy. China's current Belt and Road Initiative is an indicator that China doesn't trust other nations, even including nations like the United States, which was the wartime partner, support China in the Pacific War. Therefore, China is trying to ensure that as a global power, a new power, it is entirely self-sufficient, so it won't be subject to the economic embargoes or shortage imposed by other nations. China seeks to build a world-class military, develop its economic strengths, and create a military doctrine designed to prevent hostile forces near their country. Thank you.
That was a very illuminating story of a very complex event that occurred during the Japanese occupation of China. Meanwhile, there was a civil war, and then the effects afterwards. I find it very relevant today for us understanding those issues. So what I'd like to do now is Dr. Lee will take your questions, but I will select the person asking the question, and then we'll have someone come to you with the microphone. So would anyone online or here in our audience have a question for Dr. Lee?
If Dr. Lee is familiar with the topics, could he discuss the impact of the Yellow River flood and subsequent Henan famine during the war?
Thank you for the question. That's an important event during the war when we mentioned about the civilian casualties, civilian death caused by both Japanese occupied force and neglected local government. This is one of the cases. During Japan's conquest, Chiang Kai-shek forces failed to stop Japanese advance. So Chiang's government decided to break the dam of the Yellow River to flood a large area in order to slow down Japanese advance. But of course, at the cost of civilian casualties. Hundreds of thousands Chinese lost their lives, and millions became the refugees. So that's as one of the major events caused the civilian casualties during the early part of the war.
While you all think of your question, I have a question for you. You mentioned the 3 different phases of mainland China conceptualizing their occupation under the Japanese of being victim, and the last part being the end of humiliation. You did also mention the president of Taiwan's view. Have they also gone through a series of revisionism of how they experienced their occupation under the Japanese?
Well, the view of Taiwanese is pretty much consistent. The view emphasized on the Japanese atrocities, and they believed, remember the war to avoid another war in the Pacific, like what happened. So there was not that much change from 1950 to the current days. But there was a policy change toward Japan during those years. So during the Chiang Kai-shek years, Jiang moved to Taiwan after he lost the Civil War in 1945 until 1975. So during those 25 years, Chiang Kai-shek had some issues with Japan because of the security, national security issue, and also disputed island between Japan and Taiwan in the East China Sea. But after Chiang Kai-shek's death, the new leader, his son, Jiang Jingguo, became the president. So the relations improved between Taipei and Tokyo. So in the recent years, they became a strategic partner in terms of national defense. And also they reached certain agreement over the disputed islands in the East China Sea between Taiwan and Japan. Thank you for the question.
Just a quick question. During the war, when Mao and Chiang were working together, could there have anything been done by either party that would have changed the trajectory of China's future to where we are today? I mean, you know, would it have, you know, today we have China, we have a communist China. If they had done something different at that point, would it have changed that trajectory?
Might be, yes. That's really a lot of people thought about, you know, including Americans. Many Americans, including the officials, diplomats, tried, believe that's 8 years. You're a wartime partner, good opportunity to pull these two together, including the U.S. Ambassador Patrick Hurley during the war, including Truman's special convoy, Secretary of State, George Marshall. They both tried pretty hard during and after war, tried to keep the coalition, the team together. But somehow Jiang and Mao had different agenda, and they've been fighting against each other again in 12 years before the war. So they saw the war as an opportunity for them against the other. So there was not much chance for the both to come together during the war or after. It was pretty much like a Soviet Union and the United States, you know, the wartime partner, you know, the Red Army and Patton's 10th Army fighting against Germany side by side. But after the war, they split. The same situation in many of the countries, Nationalist Party and the Communist Party did not create a unified government.
Could you speak to the Japanese strategic interest in China and, or if you will, what the motivation was to seize and control the significant portions of the mainland?
During the wartime?
Probably, I would estimate more leading up. In other words, beginning in the mid and later 30s.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, there's a grand strategy in Tokyo. So we have time. So that's good. After the Great Depression, 1929, Japan lost 80% of international trade. They blame to America, of course, they're your fault. So you down, we went down with you. So Tokyo changed their grand strategy from global trade to a regional trade. We should trade with regional countries like Korea, China, Taiwan, Manchuria, manageable, closer. So they have this pan-Asian policy in 1930, going to Asia. So that's the beginning of the colonization of Korea, occupation of Manchuria, and then China. But just couldn't do it. You know, the big country, Japan is a small country. They already put 2 million troops, half of the total force, but still far away from the natural resources like oil, coal, rubbers, and market. Did not have a lot of economic return. The land-going expansion failed in late 1930s. So there was a strategic debate in Tokyo. So the Westerners told the Emperor, His Majesty, this land-going expansion didn't work. you should let the Navy do the job. Japan, just like Great Britain, we are an island country with limited human resources, but we should let Navy to change the direction of our expansion. We still do Asia, Pan-Asia, but not land-going. We should have an ocean-going expansion. Go to where? As Rich mentioned here, Southeast Asia. Look, those countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, they're rich in the material, in the resources, and easy to get there at lower cost. So 1939, Tokyo made change from land-going expansion to ocean-going expansion to the south. So that's how their advance slowed down after 1939, 1940. Jiang had a break. So that's kind of a strategic consideration for Tokyo toward China.
That's a great question. Can I just ask, why didn't, what if Japan had pursued a land pursuit in China rather than the naval strategy? Would that, in your mind, have made any difference?
Yes, that's probably could crash Jiang's government. So there's some story behind. I didn't mention that. Actually, there was negotiation between Jiang's government and Tokyo, and Wang Jingwei, remember that the puppet president, he was the representative for the Nanjing government to negotiate with Japan, try to make a deal with Japanese. So if Tokyo continue the land-going expansion, push all the way, so won't be too long, probably 1 more year, Jiang going to give up and will establish a deal with Tokyo.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question. Something that stood out to me during your presentation was the number of civilian deaths. And I was wondering through your research if you found that the change between the view of how occupation was for the Chinese people changed between, as you term like the victim mentality, if you saw kind of a collective public memory by the people of like the trauma that they went through, if you kind of saw any like initiatives by the people to also to share their stories or stuff like that.
Yes, they were changed. Thank you for the question. That's very important. It wasn't just government policy changing the public opinion, public view. Actually, there were, national sentiment. They feel differently toward the history and Japan. So during the early years, because of the policy and revolution in China, so they ignored the sacrifice. They believe that's necessary. We should fight. We should die for, the victory. We should celebrate because we win the war eventually. So they ignored the civilian casualties from 1950-70. But now when they open up with the West outside world, including Japan, China established diplomatic relations with Japan in 1972. So the trade began, exchange began, and Chinese people thought, that's not fair. There's no compensation, no payback, after the war. So you own us. That's kind of a common, should I pay you? You remember what you did 20 years ago? So you should pay us. So that kind of popular view during 1980, 2000, during the trade exchange era, Chinese believe that we lost so much, now it's our turn to taking back. Japanese thought that's not fair. We trade, we should have, the international regulation, should have but China had this in their, the burden or the backpack, their mentality, their witness mentality, so they try to receive more from Japan. So that was, and now, so it wasn't just Xi Jinping, the Chinese had this strong nationalistic consciousness, when they saw the Japanese warship sailed through Taiwan Strait, when they saw the Japanese self-defense force enter the South China Sea, that's not self-defense anymore. What they call China Sea. That's our sea. You're not coming again. So there was some popular support behind the current Xi's aggressive policy and behavior.
That was a great question, by the way. And if I could just follow up on that question, has there ever been any official thought in Beijing for requesting reparations from Japan?
Yes, there were several times, but played by the government as a leverage for the negotiation for the current deal. For example, during the diplomatic negotiation for the normalization of the diplomatic relations in 1972, after Richard Nixon visited China in February 1972, in April and May, Japanese sent their delegation to Beijing, negotiate a diplomatic relations. China said, well, what about the war? What about the past? So use as a leverage to establish relations with Japan, including Japan's denouncement of Taiwan. So you have to, okay, sure, you want to, with Beijing, you have to give up your diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Make sure you recognize there's only one China. Which one? Of course, us, mainland China. You have to cut off your tie with Taiwan. Japan say, no, that's not necessary. We got two Germanys in United Nations, North, South Korea, pretty much, there's no problem with one China, one Taiwan. China say, okay, if that case, what about World War II? Remember how much you own us? Japan said, okay, so one China is okay. So this is used as an instrument, as a bargaining chip so never be a real issue actually. But it's come up from time to time.
Well, that's fascinating. I see one more question here. I think we can get that in. Thank you very much.
China's 9-dash line has been ruled against by the International Tribunal Court. What can you say about the fact that China in the last couple of days expanded that to a 10-dash line? They can bypass, basically incorporating Taiwan. So in effect, China in the most recent days just expanded its claim to the South China Sea. How can that possibly be changed or corrected in the future? Do you see any way of getting that change, or is it going to require military intervention to change or remove that 10-dash line and give the people within that 10-dash line the freedom that is theirs?
Well, that's the hard question, but a very important question about China's maritime interest, oceanic sovereignties. Why China worry about those places far away from their land or over those reef islands? Why they build the artificial, islands over there? Well, that's for their national security and defense purposes. Because China is a large country, how can you protect the country if you were the president? In the 1950s, no way to stop, any foreign invasions, but we could stop a perceived or potential invasion in the foreign countries like Korea. So we send a few troops to Korea to stop Americans there to secure China for the next 20 years. And China did again in 1960 during Vietnam War. The Chinese government sent Vietnam 300,000 regular troops to fighting against Americans in the jungle. We thought we were fighting against Viet Cong, Viet Minh. There were many regular Chinese. That's one of my book, The Dragon in the Jungle, Chinese Army in the Vietnam War. So that's pretty much a concept of the Sun Tzu, the military classics, winning the war without fighting the battle. Now we're winning the national defense without fighting a war in China. Okay, now today you're talking about this. What, if anything, wrong between these two countries, I mean, American and China? How to protect your country? No way, you know, because of the technology and so in case anything wrong, we cannot choose time, but we can decide on location right there, South China Sea, 1,000 miles from China. You go ahead, drop the bomb. You know, if anything wrong, that's going to be the next battleground for the national defense. So we don't have to worry about Beijing and Shanghai because we prepared the war for you over there. So that's kind of pre-active defense. China thought that was a defensive action, but we thought as offensive, aggressive policy. So that's how the problems there and will continue. Thank you for the question.
Well, that was great. Can we all thank Dr. Li for his presentation?